This movie was cursed. The director was fired. One actor tried to escape, another refused to learn his lines, and all of that happened within the first 5 days. This is the unbelievable story behind The Island of Dr. Moreau, one of the most infamous productions in Hollywood history. The movie was never supposed to be a massive blockbuster. New Line Cinema gave it a budget of just over $30 million. The plan was to make something dark, strange, and filmmaker-driven. Think 12 Monkeys, which had come out in '95 with a similar $30 million budget. Bruce Willis had enjoyed working on 12 Monkeys, so when The Island of Dr. Moreau came along, he signed on for that one too. The man behind the project was Richard Stanley. For him, The Island of Dr. Moreau wasn't just another movie. It was his dream project. Stanley spent 4 years trying to convince New Line Cinema to make it. He showed up with a screenplay, concept art, and a very specific vision. The studio turned him down, so he came back with more artwork and more ideas. They rejected him again. He came back again. Stanley didn't have a major Hollywood track record. His best-known film was the low-budget science fiction thriller Hardware, released in 1990. It had cost about $1.5 million and earned roughly $5 million at the box office. But Stanley simply refused to go away. Eventually, New Line surrendered. The studio approved his screenplay and even agreed to let him direct. Stanley began putting together the cast he wanted. He was interested in strong, distinctive actors, not necessarily giant movie stars. His choice for the lead role was Jürgen Prochnow. New Line had other ideas. The studio believed that a famous H.G. Wells novel could attract some of the biggest names in Hollywood. And if major stars were interested, why settle for anyone smaller? That was how Marlon Brando entered the picture. New Line couldn't believe its luck. Brando was one of the most respected actors alive. By then, he rarely appeared in movies, and he seemed to spend more time making headlines for insulting Hollywood than actually working in it. Every so often, he would say something outrageous, people would become furious, Brando would apologize, and everyone would forgive him because he was Marlon Brando. The studio was thrilled to have Brando. They were less thrilled about the idea of Brando working with Richard Stanley. To New Line, pairing one of the most legendary actors with a relatively inexperienced director seemed risky. According to reports, the studio began talking to Roman Polanski about replacing Stanley. When Stanley found out, he didn't call a lawyer or start a public fight. He went directly to Brando. Stanley personally showed him the screenplay, the designs, and all the material he had spent years developing. Brando listened. The next day, he called New Line Cinema and gave the studio a very simple message. If Richard Stanley wasn't directing, Marlon Brando wasn't making the movie. The talks with Polanski ended immediately. Once Bruce Willis heard that Brando was involved, he became even more interested in the project, and he was reportedly willing to accept a much smaller salary than usual, just for the chance to work with Brando. New Line didn't need much convincing. Rob Morrow was cast as the alcoholic assistant to Dr. Moreau. Suddenly, the studio had everything it wanted. Somewhere inside New Line, somebody was probably already planning the victory party. Then Bruce Willis dropped out. Filming was going to take place in Australia, and Willis was dealing with serious problems in his marriage to Demi Moore. He didn't want to disappear to the other side of the world while his family was falling apart, so he left the movie to try to save the relationship. New Line moved quickly and replaced him with Val Kilmer. At the time, Kilmer was becoming one of Hollywood's biggest stars. He had just appeared in Batman Forever and Heat, 2 major hits, and he badly wanted the chance to work with Brando. Unlike Willis, however, Kilmer wasn't willing to do it cheaply. His salary was $6 million. Then tragedy struck. A few months before filming, Marlon Brando's daughter took her own life. Brando was 71 years old, and the loss devastated him. He had always been unpredictable and difficult, but after his daughter's death, he completely withdrew. He lost interest in the movie and disappeared to his private island. At the same time, Richard Stanley was preparing the production in Australia and becoming increasingly hostile toward New Line. He stopped updating the studio. He changed the screenplay without asking permission. He ignored messages from executives. Normally, the studio would have stepped in immediately. But Brando had personally protected Stanley, and nobody wanted to risk losing him. So New Line stayed quiet and hoped everything would somehow work itself out. It did not. On the first day of filming, Brando received another piece of terrible news. France was planning nuclear tests near an atoll he owned in the Pacific. Brando exploded. He destroyed furniture inside his trailer and refused to work. Stanley tried to keep the production moving by filming scenes that didn't require Brando. He also couldn't use Kilmer because Kilmer hadn't arrived yet. The movie's two biggest stars were both missing, and this was day one. Kilmer finally appeared a couple of days later. Then on the third day of filming, he learned from television that his wife was divorcing him. Kilmer immediately asked New Line to release him from the movie. The studio refused, but Kilmer did manage to renegotiate his role so he would spend less time on set. His original part was handed to Rob Morrow. Kilmer took over the smaller role of Dr. Moreau's alcoholic assistant. According to rumors, Kilmer agreed partly because the new role gave him more scenes with Brando. Unfortunately, the change didn't improve his mood. Kilmer was going through a painful divorce, drinking heavily and clearly did not want to be there. Almost immediately, he began sabotaging the production. He refused to memorize his lines. He improvised constantly. He criticized nearly every scene. According to people who were there, Kilmer would stand over Richard Stanley during filming with a cigarette in his hand, questioning his decisions and insulting him whenever he felt like it. On the fourth day, Rob Morrow had seen enough. He walked off the movie. Morrow personally called the head of New Line Cinema and begged to be released from his contract. He said he couldn't survive the production, didn't care how much money he was losing, and simply wanted to go home. The studio let him leave. David Thewlis was hired to replace him. Like almost everyone else, Thewlis was excited by the chance to work with Brando. Then came day 5. This time, it was Richard Stanley's turn. New Line finally fired Richard Stanley because Val Kilmer wouldn't stop calling the studio, and the reports coming from Australia made it sound like the entire production had completely fallen apart. The executives hoped that removing Stanley would calm things down. To make sure he didn't retaliate or cause more problems, they paid him his full directing fee and added extra money for the emotional damage. Then they went looking for someone willing to take over. Nobody wanted the job. Eventually, the studio found John Frankenheimer. Frankenheimer was a veteran Hollywood director, best known for films like The Manchurian Candidate. He agreed to step into the disaster, but only after negotiating an incredible deal. New Line paid him $3 million, and that was just the beginning. Frankenheimer also demanded the right to direct 3 more movies for the studio, with the freedom to choose the projects himself. That deal later gave him Ronin and Reindeer Games. Frankenheimer arrived and immediately decided Richard Stanley's screenplay had to go. He and his writer began rewriting the entire movie while it was already being filmed. The actors received new dialogue almost every day. Sometimes those pages changed again before the scenes were shot. Sometimes they changed while the scenes were being shot. To help everyone keep track, the production printed each version on paper of a different color. One color meant the dialogue was final. Another meant it should only be used if something went wrong. A third meant the pages were still open to changes. According to actor Neil Young, the rewrites became so constant that the production eventually ran out of colors. By that point, nobody knew which version of the script they were supposed to be using. Marlon Brando solved the problem in his own way. He simply refused to memorize anything. Instead, the crew gave him a tiny radio receiver and fed every line directly into his ear while the cameras were rolling. That system worked. At least until Brando's receiver accidentally picked up a police frequency. David Thewlis later recalled that, in the middle of a scene, Brando suddenly stopped performing and began reporting a bank robbery at Woolworth's. Meanwhile, Val Kilmer was drinking more, arriving later, and becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Then, Brando started arriving late too. At that point, production would sometimes stop for an entire day because neither star wanted to leave his trailer first. Brando said he would come to the set when Kilmer arrived. Kilmer said he would come out when Brando did, so both men stayed inside. What was supposed to be a 2-month shoot slowly turned into 6 months of misery. Whenever Brando finally reached the set, he started inventing new ideas. He suggested putting strange umbrellas and buckets on Dr. Moreau's head. He decorated the character's chair with peacock feathers. Every day brought another random idea, and by that point, nobody had enough energy to argue with him. The movie was already out of control. Brando was simply decorating the wreckage. Fairuza Balk was so horrified by the production that she wanted to run away. She considered leaving Australia and abandoning the film completely. Her agent warned her that New Line was already panicking and would destroy her career if she walked off the movie. So she stayed. John Frankenheimer soon realized exactly what kind of nightmare he had agreed to inherit. He wanted to quit too. Instead, he remained on set and spent most of his time fighting with Val Kilmer. In later interviews, Frankenheimer repeatedly said Kilmer was the biggest idiot he had ever met. He also promised that he would never direct another movie involving Kilmer in any possible way. When Kilmer finally completed his last scene, Frankenheimer lost control. He started shouting at the crew to get that asshole off his set immediately. By then, the movie barely resembled Richard Stanley's original vision. Actors later said that many scenes were filmed 3 or 4 different times, with different cast members, different dialogue, and completely different sets. Nobody seemed to know which version would end up in the finished movie. Toward the end of production, Frankenheimer was arguing with almost everyone. Several actors later said that Kilmer was awful, but at least he was rarely around. Frankenheimer was there every day. There was no escaping him. By the time filming ended, almost everyone hated almost everyone else. After 6 months, New Line finally had enough footage to call it a movie. Then test audiences saw it. The release was immediately delayed. The film went back into the editing room again and again as the studio desperately tried to create something coherent out of the footage. When one editor couldn't fix it, New Line hired another, then another. The problems on the island of Dr. Moreau were no longer a secret. The press knew about the firings, the rewrites, the fights, and the behavior of the stars. The movie had already been declared a disaster before anyone had even seen it. It finally reached theaters in August 1996. New Line officially claimed the budget was $40 million. Most reports put the real number somewhere between $50 and $60 million. The movie earned $49 million worldwide. So even under the most generous version of the budget, it failed. Years later, Val Kilmer accepted much of the blame for what happened. He admitted that his behavior had damaged the production and repeatedly apologized to Richard Stanley for helping get him removed from his own dream project. David Thewlis later said he could tell far more stories about the making of the island of Dr. Moreau, but if he ever told all of them, he probably wouldn't work in Hollywood again. Thewlis didn't attend the premiere. He also claims he has never watched the finished movie, and he has no plans to. But the island of Dr. Moreau still became a Hollywood legend, just not for the reason anyone had hoped. That was Frameback. Subscribe for more rewinds and see you on the next one.